Dear guests and colleagues from all over the world, I'm very happy to present to you some of the main insights of the Land Metrics Analytical report that takes stock of the global land rush and its socioeconomic and environmental repercussions. My name is Jan Lai, and I'm based at the GIGA in Hamburg. And I'm since many years a proud member of the Land Metrics team. This report is a collaborative effort of the team of authors listed on this slide and many others involved in the Land Metrics team and beyond. Let me go right into the main messages of the report. The results of our review and complementary analyses are sobering, in part alarming. Since 2000, the Land Metrics has recorded 1,865 deals with a total targeted size of 33 million hectares, as we have just heard, including a growing number of failed and abandoned projects. Implementation is slow but steady, and quite some land under contract has not yet been put into production. The non-consensual and uncompensated loss of land comes often with only little socioeconomic benefit, be they employment, newly introduced technologies, or infrastructure. Instead, large-scale land acquisitions continue to destroy rainforests and natural habitats on agricultural frontiers and put pressure on water resources. The speed of additional large-scale land acquisitions has slowed down since 2015, but may pick up again as we are seeing economic recovery from the pandemic and a tendency to open up again for land-based investments, including inland. More and more deals are coming into production, but there's also an increasing number of abandoned projects, as I have mentioned. Almost 10% of all projects have failed to date. A closer look at the deals that move into production shows that they are only doing so partially. In this graph, you can spot the partial implementation. The solid black and the dotted black line show upper and lower bounds for estimates of the percentage of the deals that have come under production. And although we cannot know with certainty, you can see the big interval, the actual implementation rate may only be around 25% of the total concluded contract size. And this means that there's a lot of room to expand production on the concluded contracts between 9 and 21 million hectares in the future. Large-scale land acquisitions remain big global business. And as you can see in the graph on the left, the 10 biggest investors come from the global north, for example, the US or the Netherlands, and the global south, with China now coming in second after Malaysia and Brazil and so forth. But often we don't know exactly where investors come from, as they operate through investment hubs or tax havens, such as Cyprus, Singapore, Hong Kong, and so forth, all among the top 10 investors. Further, as you can see on the right, the deals in the Land Metrics could add significantly to global production, in particular for oil crops. In the case of oil palm, we would add, if all is implemented, another 20% to global production. That's only the deals in the Land Metrics. But as our report shows, this potential growth comes at huge costs for local populations in the places of production. And it is in part the resistance of local populations that explains the relatively high failure of land deals that we are seeing. We do observe significant failure of land deals, as you can see from the orange circles in this figure here. That shows you the number of failed deals per country, in particular in sub-Saharan Africa. In general, investors too often underestimate the complexity of negotiations and have too little knowledge regarding the realities on the ground. Plus, miscalculations and misconceptions in planning and management are common. A spectacular example is the Jatropha hype. with 50% of the deals that stated Judge Rofer as the production intention having failed to date. And in many deals, local populations resist these large-scale projects, and our report shows that rightly so. Large-scale land acquisitions expose and exacerbate the weaknesses of land governance systems. And as you can see on this map here, they do take place in places where land governance is often weak and land tenure security low. In particular, in these contexts, consultations with locals would be of utmost importance. But only in 50% of the deals, we can see that free, prior, and informed consent took place. This matters because the land that is targeted by investors is frequently used by smallholders and pastoralists, leading to competition over land and displacement. In this map, we show estimates of the aggregate potential impacts on land deals of employment and often cited potential benefits, with dark green indicating more potential employment. Assuming full implementation here of the deals in the land metrics database, less than 0.5% of the national workforce will be employed on the acquired land in the majority of affected countries. Yet the production of a few crops creates significant employment locally. Oil palm, for example, may create, if all deals are implemented, up to 1 million additional potential jobs worldwide, and is behind some of the darker areas that you can see on this map, in particular in Southeast Asia. Yet, this is only half of the story, as many of these potential jobs are temporary and low paying. Further, the net employment effects will depend on whether large-scale land acquisitions are additional to, or at least partly replacing smallholder systems. Smallholder farms may provide up to 2 permanent jobs per hectare. This is one estimate here, but that order of magnitude. And this is considerably lower than the 0.5 workers per hectares in a coffee plantation in Uganda, or the 0.33 workers per hectare in an oil palm contract farming in Sierra Leone. These are the bars that you can see here. And much, much more than the jobs on the permanent, on the mechanized farms here for wheat and soy in Romania. There are some other studies that have shown this. Steininger and Bayerly report that a mechanized 100 hectare sugarcane farm needs about 15 workers as opposed to 70 when harvesting is done manually. And it is in particular with reference to employment that the expectations of local populations by far exceed the number of jobs that the investments either generate or are planning to generate. They contribute thus little to the problem of rural underemployment and may even aggravate it. But this is not the only risk that they entail. In our report, we also look at environmental risks. And we can see that a large share of large-scale land acquisitions are close to or overlap with natural habitats, biodiversity-rich or protected areas, in particular forests. In East Asia, for example, that's here, down here. In 2000, more than 70% of the area that is close to these large-scale land acquisitions was covered with forest. That share declined within those 20 years by almost 15 percentage points. And we are talking about a decline that is taking place, albeit not all the deals have been implemented. But not only forests are under pressure. Large-scale land acquisitions also put increasing pressure on water resources. And as we show in our report, 54% of the deals recorded in the land matrix are intended to produce crops that are high in water use. And 34% of the deals take place in dryland zones. For example, here you can spot the Nile region here. That is a major hotspot. They require, and 10% of those crops of overall of the overall deals require even large amounts of water. This is my last example of the highlights of the report that I have selected for this presentation and of the findings of the report that is available for download as of today. Let me conclude by saying that the current and future expansion of large-scale land acquisition-related production poses a significant threat to rural livelihood and natural habitats. So in our view, there's an urgent need to rethink large-scale land acquisitions. We need to find other ways to promote broad-based rural development and more endogenous growth patterns. This entails looking into other production models as alternatives, but also alongside large-scale land acquisitions. And it certainly means that smallholder farmers have to be included better and that we have to look for positive spillovers to them. This requires a fundamental change in the conduct of domestic and international businesses alike, and a dedicated and targeted effort by investor and host country governments. My colleague Ward will talk later in detail about our policy recommendations. This was my short summary of some of the highlights of the report, but I would like to end with expressing my gratitude and appreciation to all LandMatrix members within the network who have significantly contributed to the report by collecting data, providing analyses, case studies, commenting on the draft. And finally, we would like to thank our donors, without whose financial support all this would not have been possible. And with that, now over to Lisa and Lucas for some insights from the ground. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jan. Since we have 50% academics on here, taking this body of work and shoving it into 12 minutes is hard. So deep respect for doing that so well. I'd like to ask the audience right before I have a conversation with Lucas, who was named on there, and I see a number of people in this session. So thank you, all of you, for being here. If there was a word or sentence takeaway or something that struck you for the audience about that, really important feedback for us, and for Jan, if there was a word that really stuck to you or a statistic, go ahead and put that in the chat. And while you're doing that, I do want to invite Lucas, who is calling from another part of the world in a different time zone where it's a bit darker, to give us, I'm going to interview you just briefly about what, you worked on this report, but how do these findings fit in with your context in your region? And are there a story or two from the ground that exemplify this? So Lucas, who is a researcher at CONACYT in Argentina. So over to you, Lucas.
Thank you. Thank you, Lisa, and welcome everybody. It's very nice to be here. Indeed, the situation in Latin America and the Caribbean pretty much fits what has been found across the world. In our region, we have around 16 million hectares of land acquisitions and distributed in almost 800 land deals. One small difference is that almost more, I would say, than 60% of that area is already in full production, which is a different number from the global number. And the thing in our region is that large-scale land acquisitions are very often associated with land grabbing, land concentration, social environmental conflicts, land use change, inequality. So they are having a very significant impact on local populations.
Fantastic. Other insights, Lucas, for that? You have a few more minutes of any local stories or other insights you have.
Yeah, sure. We have plenty of stories in Latin America and the Caribbean. Most of them, but of course not all of them, involve conflicts. And an example, for instance, would be these land deals in Brazil made by a very famous American university that I'm not going to name here, that involves more than 400,000 hectares. And 400,000 hectares, for you to have an idea, is about 60 kilometers times 60 kilometers. And 60 kilometers is twice the distance between England and France in the English Channel, to have a kind of a global idea. But the thing is that this big university bought this land in Brazil to produce food crops and biofuels. But people in the ground say that this investment displaced and a lot of rural communities and indigenous communities in the area, and they can no longer access their forests, you know, and the natural resources they use. So there's been a lot of protests in America, but also in Brazil about this land deal. Although the company, you know, says they're not doing anything wrong and they are, you know, abiding by international law. But the thing is that a lot of deforestation of the Amazon came out of this deal, and this probably exacerbates, you know, the global climate catastrophe. So we have plenty of examples in Argentina, in Paraguay, in Uruguay. Not all of the deals involve conflicts, but most of the deals involve a certain degree of social or environmental conflict in the ground.
Thanks for that. It hit on that story, and thanks for making it so visual for us. Hit on a word that came up, Jan, displacement as a real driver. Also, we heard that from David. We also heard from Angela on the overlaps of biodiversity in these rich areas. So definitely, thanks for bringing that to life with such a real example. I want to move over, and thanks for the questions coming in. We're noting them. I want to move over to what was to be an interview with Nonette Royer, who's the executive director of the tenure faculty in Sweden. Unfortunately, she is sick, sends her greetings, but standing in, very excited to have David Kemowitz. David, if you can wave. He serves as the Climate and Land Use Alliance's senior advisor in Mexico and Central America. What was your big takeaway from the report? I saw that you put the word displacement there. And were there any big surprises, anything like, oh, I wasn't expecting that? So David, over to you.
Thank you very much, Lisa. First, just a clarification. It's the tenure facility, not the tenure faculty. And I am the manager of the Forest and Farm Facility, which is a partnership between FAO, IUCN, AgriCord, and IIED, no longer at CLUA. But I would like to say that I am very happy to stand in for Nonette because the tenure facilities work is so important. And I think it's precisely this report which really highlights the importance of the tenure facilities work. I want to thank the Land Matrix team for putting this together, because it would be very easy to think that the large-scale land acquisition issue was an issue from 10 years ago and that it wasn't continuing to go on today. But what we're seeing is exactly the opposite. We're seeing continued pressure on community lands, on smallholders, on pastoralists, and we need to continue to produce the data, the evidence that shows what we're talking about, that shows that an important part of these lands in the land acquisitions are lands that were already being used for agriculture by smallholders, that were already being used for grasslands for pastoralists, that already in many cases have customary and ancestral rights, which have not been recognized. And so the importance of strengthening those ancestral and customary rights in the face of this, and the importance of having serious and significant consultation. We've heard already from the authors here that over half of the cases, there was no consultation to speak of at all, much less the sort of consultation that we would hope to see. So the big message here is that land rights for communities, for smallholders, for indigenous peoples and local communities are very important. And the other big message from my perspective is you could make a lot of claims about the benefits that, you know, somehow it's okay if we don't respect the rights of these people because it's going to bring to some sort of big development here. But we're just not seeing that development. We're not seeing huge new employment. We're not seeing lots of new infrastructure, lots of new taxes. What we're seeing is further deforestation. What we're seeing is greater pressure on the water supplies. What was the big surprise? I guess more than a surprise, it's a reminder, which is that these large-scale land acquisitions tend to spike when food prices spike. And right now, we are seeing a major spike in food prices globally. And that might be considered a surprise. I was involved about a year ago, at the beginning of at the end of 2020, looking at the first year of COVID and the pandemic and its impact on global agriculture. And kind of the expectation a year ago was that maybe the global economy would collapse and we would see food prices declining and agricultural prices declining around the world. What we're seeing is the opposite. What we're seeing is a major spike in prices, which is explained in part by the economic recovery that we've seen not post-pandemic, but despite the pandemic, in part by the massive droughts, which are taking place all over the world as a result of climate change. And so we have to ask ourselves the question, are we going to be in a low food price world or a high food price world? My guess is that the pressure is going to continue and that's going to make these land rights issues all that much more important. So I'm very proud and happy today to be able to speak on behalf of NONET, because there's nothing more important than the tenure facility today as we're talking about these issues. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Thank you for bringing NONET in and for your contributions to that. It's created quite a buzz. As you can see, the chat has a lot of questions, which we will get to in a minute. And I see people are responding real time, so thanks, keep that coming. We've laid out the problem, and David put a emphasis on the perfect storm of things happening right now in the world with climate change and prices and the challenges with that. But of course, the report wouldn't be what it is without some policy recommendations about what to do. And that's why we're here. So very happy to turn the floor over to Ward and Siwu. He's a researcher at CIRAD and the International Land Coalition in Italy. So Ward, over to you.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you very much. I will share my screen just for my presentation.
As an American on this call, I see the university that will not be named has been named, so it's in the chat, Ward, as you're pulling up your presentation.
There we go. Can you see my screen?
Yep.
Thanks, Lisa. Thank you very much. So I'll go to the recommendations of the report. I think, Lisa, it has been clear over the years that the points of views and the perspectives with regards to large-scale land acquisitions vary significantly. But what this report does is to put black on white that 10 years down the road, the results regarding large-scale land acquisitions are either marginal or rather negative. As Jan did, this is not only a call to review large-scale land acquisitions and to make them better deals, it is also a call to rethink agricultural and rural development strategies and investments. So therefore, this report puts to the fore 5, and I think quite far-reaching recommendations. I will go very quickly through the 5, although I won't have time to detail all of these 5 sets of recommendations. Sorry, it's 11 recommendations in 5 sets. So the first one is about land governance and the call to improve land governance. It's not an original one, I know, but unfortunately, it's a recurrent one that we have to make here. The results of the report showed very well when we try to assess the implementation of the VGTs, that there's a huge difference between the call at global and national level and the improvements that have been made with regards policy and the effective results and the changes on the ground. Actually, 30% of the deals in Africa do not comply with the VGT guidelines at all. And 80% of the deals have an unsatisfactory level of compliance of the VGTs or the FNGs, the framework in Africa. So our first goal, again, not very original, but we have to make it as we are far from the results that we're trying to achieve, is to fast-track land governance reforms and their implementation based on the VGTs and FNGs. This has to be accompanied, and that's recommendation 2, by assuring policy compliance through national and local multi-stakeholder engagement platforms. It's not the states or the governments themselves that can assess compliance of their own policies. This has to be broadened up to multi-stakeholder platforms engaging civil society, academics, but also international communities, the donors and the investors themselves. From land governance, we go to investments, and the second set of recommendations calls for improving investments, especially with a focus on smallholder inclusion. And here again, the first recommendation, recommendation number 3, is about the rise and some of the global frameworks that have to be fast-tracked still. However, it puts the focus on local development. We need to make these large-scale land acquisitions more focused on infrastructure development at local level, on spillover effects, on engaging smallholder farmers, etc. But agriculture investment should go beyond minimizing the possible negative impacts of these large-scale land investments. And we need to think beyond. We need to look beyond. And that's recommendation 4. That is a call for strategic approaches for broad-based rural development to be developed and implemented by these countries, and have a broad focus on inclusion of smallholder farmers and indigenous growth at local level. So we need to go beyond the large-scale land acquisitions and rethink, as Jan said, local development and agriculture and rural development. Recommendation 3, or the third set of recommendations, is about changing the global rules. And here there's a call to integrate human rights into investment treaties and global value chains. Recommendation 5 calls for human and other basic rights, whether it's food and water, but also land rights and the environment, to be included in international investment treaties. For this, national multi-stakeholder platforms, as called in a previous recommendation, can be used to develop and follow up such treaties and frameworks. But here it's also a call to at the international level to multilateral bodies such as the G20 or the parliamentary bodies like the Pan-African Parliament or the European Parliament to develop and follow up the implementations of such strategies and make sure that human rights and other basic rights are included and complied to. Sixth one is the mandatory inclusion of these rights, human rights and these other basic rights, in due diligence legislation, with a focus on the local populations and capacity building for these populations to be able to use these rights and these due diligence legislations for their own sake. Here again, international community can be of support. Fourth set of recommendations is about the environment and about halting environmental destruction. Jan said it very well. The environment is one of the main negative aspects of these investments. So the report calls for a total moratorium of large-scale land acquisitions with negative environmental impacts or with potential environmental impacts. The global donor community here needs to support these changes by creating incentives to governments for target countries to commit to such changes. Climate policies and climate funding can be used for this. It will be important to accompany these agreements with strong safeguards and monitoring mechanism to avoid these environmental damages. And that's why this stop needs to be included, as is detailed here in recommendation at 8, in broader comprehensive landscape plans, which will include and which will have to include trade-offs between the environmental, the economic, and also the social objectives of such investments. The last set of recommendations is about transparency and accountability. To do this work, and especially to evaluate, to assess the implementation of the VGTs, we saw that for all the variables in the land matrix, about 15 to 20% of the data points are available. So 80% of the data actually of the variables is still not yet available. And this after 10 years of hype and 10 years of calls for more transparency and 10 years of investment and initiatives like the land matrix and other projects out there to gather information and to make all this more transparent. So fifth set is about reinforcing transparency, allowing for more accountability. Recommendation 9 calls for binding commitments to increase transparency and to making these commitments even compulsory when public capital is involved. They should be supported by donor countries that should provide a mandate and support independent transparency initiatives like this one and many others at national level like observatories, etc. More broadly, there should be a continuous monitoring at local level of land ownership, but also land control, land transaction, and land use change. Only then we will be able to make these transactions more accountable and these investors more accountable, but also will we be able to use this information for engaging in more sustainable development trajectories. I'll stop it here and open for Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ward. We'll get right to the Q&A in just a second. I'm just really struck about how you talked about some things that aren't new calls. They've been calls for going on for quite some time. So we might get into the Q&A at what's stopping the transparency or what's stopping the inclusion. Before we go to a discussion on this though, Ward chunked up these policy recommendations into sections. I want to do a quick poll, which is a bit complex, but you'll be able to do it, I know, of sort of vote for the policy recommendation that stands out the most to you. That's not saying that you don't think they're all important. Of course they are, but I'll give you a minute to go ahead and click on maybe the biggest lever you think is possible. So I'll let you read this for just a second. We've taken these 11 and pushed them into 9. And while you're voting, I will very kindly welcome our next discussant, Janet Ademi. Janet, can we get a wave? Can we see you somewhere? You're going to come up, I know, in any second. I see you're on here. Someone could spotlight Janet. That would be great. Janet, if you could come off mute, be great. Janet is going to talk about, she's the head of Rural Development Division, Department of Agricultural, Rural Development, the Blue Economy and Sustainable Environment at the AUC. So do we have Janet yet? There she is. I see you coming on. While she's coming on, Clara, if lots of people have answered the poll, let's see what people say right before we hear from Janet. Janet, can you hear me? We don't hear you, Janet. What would be a webinar without some sound issues? The joy of technology. Janet, can you hear us? Can you give me a thumbs up if you can hear me?
Lisa, can you hear me?
There, we've got you. I'm just going to report back on the poll. Thanks for your patience. So, Janet,
me, Lisa?
I can hear you. Can you hear us? Maybe, Janet, turn off your video in case there's a broadband issue. People are smiling, sending some good vibes our way as we deal with this. Thanks, Jan, for the smile, and Sandra and Judith. We've all been there, right, in these moments?
Yes, I can.
You can hear. Okay. There might be a little bit of a lag, but we're going to give this a try. So just quickly, you all can see on your screen these poll results. So It's kind of all over the board, which makes sense. People have different ideas on the right lever, but the number one is human and other basic rights need to be included in these international investments, followed by pursue the fast track land governance space. Super. So Janet, thank you so much for joining. Thank you everyone for sharing your thoughts. As you can see from the report, both Ward and Jan, the results show that although there has been some progress, implementation of global and regional policies at deal and investment level remain poor. You just saw what the participants, the levers they thought they would pull. Are there one or two policy recommendations that you think can move things more quickly? So Janet, over to you. I see you're muted. I'm sure you're going to come off mute. We'll give you.
Yes, I'm unmuted, Lisa. And apologies, I don't know what's wrong with my network this afternoon, but hopefully it's going to hold on for me to give my intervention on this report. I hope you can hear me.
Perfect. Go for it, Janet. Go for it. It's one of those days for Janet. I had one of these yesterday. While we're getting Janet back, I'm going to just go into some of the questions that have been asked. So Janet, you interrupt as soon as you can get through. One of the questions, Jan, that we heard that came up is the role of COVID. We saw in one of your charts the year that COVID hit. David Wardle has a question about if you could expand a little bit on the pandemic and its impact and what we've learned. So Jan, over to you.
Yes, yeah, thanks. I'm following the active discussions in the chat. That's very good to see. On COVID, well, I think for now we can only speculate about the potential consequences, and David already alluded to a potential scenario, which could be that what we're seeing right now is another commodity price hike, which in my view can lead on the one hand to expanding production on at a significantly higher pace that as we have seen in the past, and where we would not know this now, but I think that's a very present threat. On top of that, we might see even more or something similar of what we have seen in the late 2000s, and when the speed of additional acquisitions rose significantly. I think that's these are the potential two scenarios which are not unlikely. And I think together with the other findings that we have presented today, mean that we really, all of us, have to pay attention that implementation does not take place under the same conditions as it has happened apparently in the past.
Super, Jan and Ward, you've been following, which is questions, debates, back and forth, people answering. So jump in if you want to address any of them. One that has come up a few times is the intersection of gender and data and women's rights. That's one I will throw to maybe to you, Jan, or either. But is there any question, Ward or Jan, you want to make sure that you address publicly to everyone, since there's been so many?
Yes, what you can think. Meanwhile, the one on inclusion. So what do we mean by inclusion of smallholders? Why do we talk about inclusion at all? There's been a small debate around this. Why, with these findings, think at all that this could be useful? So this meaning large-scale investments. I think the message of our report is that the model, how that large-scale agricultural projects in particular, as they are being implemented with the crop patterns, with the cropping patterns, with the technologies, are not delivering at all on the promises that many well, maybe not that many here, but many in international institutions, for example, thought they would be able to deliver. And that's, I think it has changed my perspective, at least, on what this production mode can deliver. But I would not say that it's absolutely inconceivable that foreign investments can contribute to rural development in one way or another, but it needs to do so under very different conditions. And some of the conditions we are spelling out very explicitly in this report, including, for example, the inclusion of human rights and the environment in due diligence laws, that is in investor countries, as well as, of course, appropriate regulations in the places where these investments take place. But I think Ward may want to add here.
Ward.
I just want to comment on that, and in the meantime respond to a question of Danny Wainwright, and it's related to that. And he says large-scale land acquisitions focus on monocultures. Supply chains of companies are exclusive, etc. Should we not promote more sustainable development as agroecology, etc. And he's absolutely right. And I think what we say here is that on one hand, we should accompany better these large-scale land acquisitions, but all these policies behind it should not only there to minimize the negative aspects of that. We should think beyond that. And agroecology, agricultural production models that are more sustainable environmentally and more inclusive socially, short value chains, local development, etc., are only a couple of alternative ways of rethinking that are more sustainable in the broad way. But that starts by rethinking the entire policy framework. It's not about outsourcing anymore, but it's looking into the countries, it's looking to indigenous growth. And that's a huge task for governments, for donors, etc. And it starts with focusing on basic infrastructure. It starts with focusing on your agriculture development infrastructure, on your agriculture research, etc. So it's an entire package, and it's not here about saying yes to one and no to the other. It's about preparing, accompanying governments, but also investors and donors in a broader approach to rural development, a broader approach for more social inclusion, and a broader approach at landscape level, as we say, for more environmental sustainable development.
Fantastic. News from Janet. She sends her deep apologies. The internet is just too slow today. So she's going to send her comments in writing. So we will work with the Land Matrix team on how to share, I think, are really important comments from the position that she sits in on the policy recommendation. So yeah, Ward, go ahead.
Yeah, and just I'm reading the comments here, and of course these models they don't come alone. They come with people behind it, of course, and here gender is very important, but also indigenous peoples and local communities are very important. Pastoralists, etc., etc. These are the population groups that have been supporting and have been engaged in sustainable practices, and that are part and parcel of these more sustainable development models. So although the report doesn't have a concrete focus on certain population groups, nor on gender, they are very much present in our recommendations, because as alternatives to large-scale land acquisition, it is the support to women, it is the support to youth, it is the support to indigenous peoples and local communities that are the stewards of these more sustainable development practices.
Thanks, Ward. Jan, you want in on some of these other questions?
Yes, I think one thing that we haven't talked about yet are the local institutions, right? And I think there are quite a few among in the audience who also work with these local institutions and help mobilize against large-scale land acquisitions on the ground. And I think I would like to change a bit the perspective on what I have called failure in my presentation. Right? So in a sense, this failure to some extent also represents a success of some of the work on the ground. Since quite a few of these deals fail, they don't take place because locals mobilize against investors, and in some cases successfully so. The reason being the lack of appropriate negotiations, and including people, including smallholders in particular, in those negotiation processes. I think that's a message that we detail, on which we provide quite some detailed empirical evidence also in the report, that this is not a singular anecdotal case here and there, it's systematic, right? So you can see it all over the globe in many different contexts. Talking about local institutions, I think we should not fail to mention that they do play an ambiguous role, in particular local elites. That is well established, and that's also evidence that is no longer relies on a single case. Local chiefs, in sub-Saharan African context, for example, can play an ambiguous role when investors arrive in the village with the intention to acquire huge tracts of land. I think you all know that, and that has to be taken into account in helping communities to negotiate or resist such investments. Now, taking it from the very local to the global, if I may, since it's a link, I mean, that is something that we have talked about for many years now, right? And it's present in particular in the land community, and awareness that these problems are here and present. But I think one novelty also report is that we are making the explicit link to bilateral investment treaties, that was also mentioned in the chat, and global value chains in particular. And I want to again mention due diligence laws that we are seeing that emerging in quite a few European countries, also to some extent in the US, that we hope will have repercussions on the way businesses do their business with regard to land. It will be an issue, and I think it's a good moment, in particular in Germany, as we will be following up on our due diligence law as we put it into practice, that this becomes an issue, that if you import food from somewhere, that you take into account what happens to land rights when you acquire land in the places that we have talked about.
Thank you. There's so much activity in the chat. We're going to save the chat and make sure that we capture all of the points, maybe even the debates, the suggestions, and it gets shared. So I know a number of you have asked me about that. You've also asked if this is going to be recorded in the PowerPoints. We will put a package together with the Land Matrix folks and make sure that we share as much as we can according to the laws and the rules. And I realize that we're working in lots of different languages, and unfortunately we're going to just run out of time to answer all the questions. So we'll do our best to follow up how we can. Michael Taylor, the Secretariat Director of the International Land Coalition, I want to get you in here from the ILC's perspective. Any final comments about this Land Matrix 3 report from your perspective? So Michael.
Thank you, Lisa. And firstly, a big congratulations to all the co-researchers that have been part of putting out this report. As I reflect back to 10 years ago when we started this partnership, at that time, many of our members in ILC were sounding the alarm bells, saying that they were seeing a huge increase in investment interest in land where they were working, and could see a lot of risks and dangers associated. There were also some ILC members which said, well, the jury is not out yet. There could be benefits, and we can't say that these are necessarily going to be destructive. And I think this is the key evidence that this report gives us, in that the evidence is overwhelmingly the impacts are dismal. Dismal for society, dismal for the environment, and even dismal economically in the very area that they said that they would help. It's been quite interesting following the chat and listening at the same time, because I think a lot of people have been pointing out in the chat as well that maybe this is the time that we should be less shy in our recommendations and much clearer. And I think from the point of view of ILC within our network, the evidence is very clear. And while we know that in the global arena in which we work, many debates carry on despite evidence to the contrary, and one example for is the World Food System Summit that many of our members were involved in last week. That was very controversial about how we need to fix the broken food systems, and many of our members were part of a big pushback against the corporatization of agriculture and against the extreme concentration of control of food value chains that we're seeing taking place around the world. Still, solutions were rolled out that didn't seem to take a real cognizance of that reality and of the clear advantages of agroecological approaches and the role of small farmers in producing good, healthy and equitable food. So I think at this point in history where the world is really starting to come to terms with the reality of the climate crisis that we live in, as well as seeing the possibility to react decisively and quickly to an emergency like COVID, is our chance to be more outspoken, our chance to act together and move in a different direction. I think we can say with confidence that overwhelmingly this is where the ILC membership wants to go, and as we move into a new strategy starting from next year that will take us to 2030, this will be very much what we work for as ILC. So thank you, Lisa. Thank you for an absolutely fantastic discussion. I do hope that we'll get a transcript of the comments as well, because there was a lot in there that we were trying to follow at the same time as listening. But it's been great, and will very much inform how we continue to work on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. As you know, I've been following the chat as well, and there are voices that I wish we had another hour or two to get in, Martin from Fundapaz, others from around the world, this real global perspective. So maybe there's a follow-up where we workshop some of this stuff more. And I'm always quite struck around, there's the analysis that was laid out, then there's the what of the recommendations, and then there's that hard part of the how, the actual implementation around this. And that's something that we think a lot about at Apolitical, with helping public servants do that, just the hard work of the how of inclusion and transparency. So with that, if everyone, there's lots of questions, like I said, we're going to take these all in, try to answer them the way we can and follow up. But let's leave with the final, your one-word takeaway or one-word or dash recommendation. Michael said, be more bold, right? Do you have one sort of final comment to put in the chat with 1 minute left? Let's get that started. One word, mine's going to be how to do this, how to implement that. We'll share Janet's comments to the best we can. Let's see, Angela, I know you're going to put something in there. Sandra, Linda, I'll call you out. Insa, Quinton, Sophie, transparency. Yeah, very much. Relevance. Yeah, I saw that with the question mark. Martin or David, you want to add? The very top of the hour. Well, you're putting that in, for whom? Yeah, the audiences. We heard some stuff around gender and for whom, and the role of businesses and universities, leadership. Yeah, the monitoring. Let us create and give ourselves space to imagine something different. Yeah. As Ray Bradbury said, it starts off, human beings start writing a romance before they make it a reality. So what's our romance novel to citizens in the world? Partnership with the private sector, how to make it beneficial. So at the top of the hour, so I'll be right on time. I see there's a hand up. I'm sorry we don't have more time, but put your question in the chat. Let's wave at everyone. We're real people caring about real things. Thank you. There'll be a report up there. You can click on that and we'll follow up on the Land Matrix website. So thanks everyone. Thanks to our interpreter.